Hi everyone, welcome back to another video. So, welcome to another episode of Christian Apologetics. And today I'm gonna answer to this very common objection argument that is presented against Christianity and against different kind of religions, and that is the incompatibility between God's foreknowledge and free will. If God knows, God is omniscient, God knows everything, God knows what I'm gonna do, what we all humans are gonna do, then are we really free to do it? Is it like God's knowledge, in a sense, just forcing us to do only one thing, the thing that He foreknows that we're going to do? And therefore, in this sense, this argument tries to present the fact that God's foreknowledge, being absolute, excludes the fact that we are truly free in doing our choices and actions. Now, I've gone here to this website, which presents this argument. This argument can be used in different ways. It can be used for choices, it can be used for good or bad, it can be used for salvation, someone accepting and believing in God, or someone rejecting God. So it can be used for many different things, but at the end of the day, the argument is the same. And it says here, does God know or does He not know that a certain individual would be good or bad? If thou sayest He knows, then it necessarily follows that that man is compelled to act as God knew beforehand he would act. Otherwise, God's knowledge would be imperfect. And as we know, God's knowledge can't be imperfect by definition, right? God is perfect, God is all-knowing, and if God would be wrong, God would be wrong in about something, then He would not really be God anymore, right? So you can see how important it is. And now this argument commits what's called the modal scope fallacy. So in modal logic, what is necessary and what is possible. So the necessity and possibility of things being true or false. And now, as personally, I approach this this argument when it's presented in three kind of different ways. The first way I use it is I try to show that knowledge doesn't equate causation. So the fact that I know something or that God foreknows something doesn't mean that He's causing or He's determining that particular action or event. And we could use many different examples here in our daily lives. Suppose a parent that has some children and he knows them very, very well. And he can almost foreknow that if he's gonna put his children in a certain situation, he would know that the children would act in a certain way, would do some certain things. Of course, this is a parent, these are children, we're humans, God is perfect, so His knowledge is absolute. But in a sense, try to imagine that a parent knowing, because he knows their children so much, that a parent could, in a sense, foreknow what the children might do, is not in any way coercing or causing or determining the children to behave in that particular way. They're still behaving as they are freely doing it. So in the same sense, God knowing or foreknowing our actions doesn't necessarily imply that God is causing or determining our actions. Again, this kind of idea of compelled, that we are kind of forced. God's knowledge is forcing us to act in a certain way. And I think that that's a mistake, because knowledge does not imply causation. Now, the actual way in which you can refute this argument is, as I said before, because this argument commits the modal scope fallacy. And that is a problem when a certain proposition being true doesn't necessarily imply that the conclusion is also true. So imagine there are two premises. Necessarily, if God foreknows that X will happen, then X will happen. God foreknows X will happen, therefore necessarily X will happen. Now the problem in modal logic is on that necessarily. It doesn't logically follow that necessarily X will happen. It just follows that X will happen. And this is a problem of necessity and possibility, because X, the event X, is contingent. Therefore, the fact that God's foreknowledge is true, therefore that event will happen, doesn't necessarily imply that that event is also true. So God's foreknowledge being true about the event doesn't necessarily mean that the event is also true. And now there is this website I'm going to put in the description below. It does a very good job in explaining the difference between necessity, possibility. You have all the terms right here. So this is the necessity, right? This is the necessity term in logic. This is the possibility, and this is continuously. And remember that a proposition, in order to be possible, it just means that it's if it's not self-contradictory. So all propositions that are true are possibly true. That's something that can be said. Some false propositions are also possibly true, namely those that are false but are not self-contradictory. And then it says, when it says that P is necessary, it means necessarily true propositions are those that are true in all possible circumstances. Words, that is, are not false in any. So it says necessarily true can be defined in terms of possibility, namely P is necessary if and only if its negation, that is not P, is impossible. All right, so that's the idea. And these examples of necessarily true propositions, like 2 + 2 is 4, all ants are female, whatever is blue is colored, and it is false that some triangles has exactly 4 sides. So that's the idea. Instead, some possibly true propositions is this one: Ottawa, Canada is north of Washington, D.C., or the Great Salt Lake is saltier than the Dead Sea, and or the Dead Sea is saltier than the Great Salt Lake, and so forth. And then we have the P is contingent. Now it says here that P is contingent if and only if it's both possibly true and possibly false. Now, contingent propositions are those that are true in some possible circumstances, words, and are false in some possible circumstances, words, right? So contingency can be defined in the terms of possibility, and this is the actual logical symbols used. Now, again, remember that it doesn't mean that P is true and false in some possible circumstances of words at the same time, because that would violate the law of non-contradiction, right? So no proposition whatsoever is both true and false in the same set of circumstances, right? So to say a proposition is contingent is to say that it is true in some possible circumstances and is false in some other circumstances. Some examples, for example, is this: the Boston Red Sox won the World Series in 2002. Or is this false that the Boston Red Sox won the World Series in 2002? So you can see how these are contingent. They are possible in some circumstances and false in other circumstances. In our world, it could be true, but in some other words, some other circumstances, it could be false. So see, that's the idea. Now, that being explained, the modal fallacy involves this idea of necessity and possibility. Now, I'm going to try to show you here Dr. William Lane Craig is a very good philosopher, and how he explains this idea. And yeah, I hope like he has a very good job in explaining it. So I hope you can follow.
So the New Testament clearly teaches that God has foreknowledge of all these things that are going to happen. Now, the fatalist says that if God foreknows what you're going to do, then when the time arrives for you to do it, you're not free to do anything else because God cannot be mistaken.
So that's the kind of argument, right? So here, the Dr. Craig is using the fatalist, which is again a determinist. So this kind of argument, an objection, is presented by the determinist, because the determinist is saying because God's foreknowledge is absolute, in a sense, it's determining. So it's determinist, fatalist. Therefore, you're not really free. So determinism is logically incompatible with free will, because it's impossible. You can't, if everything happens necessarily, then also your actions happen necessarily. So you're not really free in doing those actions, right? So that's the idea.
And since he has believed from eternity that you're going to do it, that means you're fated to do it. It seems to me, however, that the argument for logical or theological fatalism commits a fallacy in modal logic. This is the logic of necessity and possibility.
So that's what I said before, right? So that's the fallacy that it causes.
The fatalist reasons like this: necessarily, if God foreknows X, then X will happen.
So that's the first premise, right? So necessarily, it means that it is true that if God foreknows a certain thing will happen, then that will happen, and that is because God's foreknowledge is absolute. God can't be mistaken.
2, God foreknows X.
So again, that the first premise is true. The second premise, God foreknows X will happen. So again, that same proposition also is true.
3, then, therefore, necessarily X will happen.
See, once again, therefore necessarily X will happen, and that's the modular fallacy. It doesn't necessarily follow that if God foreknowledge is absolute and God foreknowing an event, that necessarily that event will happen. And look here how Craig explains this idea.
So premise 1, necessarily, if God foreknows X, then X will happen. 2, God foreknows X. 3, therefore necessarily X will happen. And if X happens necessarily, it means it's not free. That commits a logical fallacy. From the two premises, you cannot deduce that necessarily X will happen. All that follows is simply X will happen, but not necessarily.
So see here, X will happen, but not necessarily. And why is that?
It could fail to happen.
See here, that is why the event is contingent, as I tried to explain to you before. Contingent means that it can be false. So it's possible that it's false. So there is a world in which that event doesn't happen, and therefore that it's false.
But if it were to fail to happen, then God would have foreknown something different.
And see, that's how God's foreknowledge acts. So if the event would have been different, would have failed to happen, then God's foreknowledge also would have been different. So see here the logic.
So by your actions, you have the ability, by what you do, in a sense, to determine what God will have believed in the past.
So this is the conclusion, right? That it is, in a sense, your choice, your action, that is determining God's foreknowledge. So God's foreknowledge is based on the action that you're doing. But there is here a distinction that we have to make. Otherwise, we could guess that there was a time in which God didn't know what we would do, right? But that's what Craig explains next.
His knowledge is sort of like an infallible barometer of the weather. The barometer never fails. It's always right. But clearly, the barometer doesn't determine the weather.
So see here, the example he gives, like God's foreknowledge is like the weather. So it's a barometer. The barometer never fails. It's always right. But in a sense, the barometer is not causing or determining the weather, right? It's the weather, in a sense, that is determining what the barometer is saying.
If the weather were different, the barometer would have been.
So if the weather would be different, then the barometer would have been different as well.
Different. So the foreknowledge of God is like an infallible barometer, and you're free to do whatever you want, but you're just not free to fool the barometer. God knows whatever it is you do. So your action is logically prior to what God foreknows.
So this is important because this allows us not to, in a sense, think that we are above God, that our actions are actually above God's foreknowledge. So our actions, do you hear Gregor says that our actions are logically prior to God's foreknowledge. So logically, God's foreknowledge has to be subsequent, posterior to our action, right? Because it's our action that is determining God's foreknowledge. But
God foreknows, but his foreknowledge is chronologically prior to what you do.
But his foreknowledge here is chronologically prior to your action. Remember that God is outside time. So it is our actions that are determining God's foreknowledge. Logically, our actions are logically prior God's foreknowledge. But God's foreknowledge is chronologically prior our actions because God is outside time. And he foreknows from all eternity how the world and all humans would do. And therefore, God is still God. It's not like we are overpowering God, or in a sense, God doesn't really know what happens until we do it, right? God has always known because his foreknowledge is absolute, but because God is separated from time, so it's not linked or limited to time. And yeah, that's the end of the video. Now, I just want to, at the very end, to read you again a quote from C.S. Lewis that I think explains this kind of idea of God being outside time, God not being in time, therefore allowing him to see, therefore to know what we're going to do, but not because he's foreseeing what we might do, but because he knows simply because our future has already happened in God's eyes. That is what it means when God is outside time. Now here says C.S. Lewis, another difficulty we get if we believe God to be in time is this. Everyone who believes in God at all believes that he knows what you and I are going to do tomorrow. But if he knows I'm going to do so and so, how can I be free to do otherwise? Well, here once again, the difficulty comes from thinking that God is progressing along the timeline like us. The only difference being that he can see ahead and we cannot. Well, if that were true, if God foresaw our acts, it would be very hard to understand how we could be free not to do them. But suppose God is outside and above the timeline. In that case, what we call tomorrow is visible to him in just the same way as what we call today. All the days are now for him. He does not remember you doing things yesterday. He simply sees you doing them, because though you have lost yesterday, he has not. He does not foresee you doing things tomorrow. He simply sees you doing them, because though tomorrow is not yet there for you, it is for him. You never suppose that your actions at this very moment were any less free because God knows what you are doing. Well, he knows your tomorrow's actions in just the same way, because he is already in tomorrow and can simply watch you. In a sense, he does not know your action till you have done it. But then the moment at which you have done it, it is already now for him. And that is what Craig was doing, right? Your action is logically prior to his foreknowledge, but is chronologically prior compared to your action, because he knows it before, because it's outside time. So that's the idea of our future actions. We don't know them, and that's why they are mystery. We don't know them. But God, that is outside time, has already seen our future choices, and that's why he knows them. So see how it is our actions that are determining God's foreknowledge. But because God is outside time, his foreknowledge is chronologically prior our actions. And yeah, that's how you reconcile God's foreknowledge and free will. And you can see here, that's the kind of the picture here. So depending what you choose to do, that is what creates or determines God's foreknowledge. But God's foreknowledge is chronologically prior your actions. But your actions have to be logically prior to God's foreknowledge. Otherwise, God would not be truly God, and this would be a real problem. But yeah, that's the idea. I'm gonna put all these links in the description below if you want to check them out. And yeah, thanks for watching. See ya. God bless you. Bye bye.